Okay, here we are. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for being here today, and thanks also to Columbia, Jason, and the whole team for putting this together. As you just heard, I'm Ravi Agrawal with Foreign Policy, and we've got some terrific guests here to talk about energy in an era of fractured geopolitics. Now, the title kind of explains itself, but I woke up this morning, and like all of you, I couldn't help but look at what was going on in the markets, but also the fact that we're now in pretty much a full-blown trade war, which I'm sure has implications for the energy markets, but also, way beyond that. And geopolitics is particularly interesting here because, if you really put the geo and the geography in geopolitics, energy is at the heart of that. So between great power competition, US, China, the tariffs now, the war in Ukraine, what's going on in the Middle East, there's a lot to unpack and how that affects things. So Megan, I'm going to start with you if I can. If you could reflect a little bit on how you think the latest round of tariffs and increasing tensions between America and China will end up affecting the geopolitics of energy, which is something you have worked on for so long.
Sure. Thank you, Ravi. It's great to be with you, and thanks to Jason and the whole CGIP team for putting this together. It's nice to have something like this to come to on this morning rather than just sitting on your phone and kind of doom scrolling. So
this can be group therapy.
Yeah, group therapy. But I mean, let me just begin at a very high level where you set us, which is that we heard from many people close to the Trump administration that the desire of the administration was to fundamentally restructure the global economy and America's position in the global order. And that seemed sort of abstract to some, but now it's very tangible. And we're in a place where I think a very important myth has been busted twice in the last 3 years at very high consequence. And that myth is that highly integrated economies won't do much to jeopardize that relationship because of the importance of economic interdependence. So the first time that myth was busted was with the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, where the whole idea that that interdependence was going to be a buffer against actions that were not seen as being in short-term interest. And now we're seeing it this morning with a real trade war between the US and China, with the US having 104% tariffs on Chinese goods and the Chinese bringing their tariffs up to 84% and a number of other things that go alongside that. So I would say that we're still in a situation where negotiations could ensue between the US and China, and I certainly wouldn't rule that out. The thing that I would underscore, however, is that we know that even if negotiations do ensue and they do lead to an agreement, that this is going to have a pretty significant impact on value and the global economy. If we just look at the first Trump administration and the phase one agreement that was ultimately reached, that took years to negotiate, and it did lead to a loss of economic value. So I think a negotiation is possible, but we have to keep in mind that even though China's not a democracy, it really does have domestic politics, and this is a time where the Chinese economy is in a very weak position. And so these tariffs are really threatening to the regime. And just look at Fitch, which downgraded China about a week ago for structural erosion to the revenue base. That was the reason they gave for downgrading China. And so putting these tariffs on at this particular time, no less during a Chinese holiday, which wasn't appreciated in Beijing, and I think you have, it's going to be very, very hard for both sides to come together and make concessions unless there's some way to arrange for it to not look like the other side is ceding to another. But the biggest point I'll leave you with, and the most important point, is that we have to keep in mind, not just us in the room, but everybody who's making decisions of great consequence to the global economy, is that economics and politics and geopolitics are not separate. There's not a bright line between this economic restructuring in the tariff war, and politics and geopolitics. And the economic relationship between the US and China has been the ballast of that relationship, that we've gone through ups and downs and security considerations and technological competition, but the economic piece has been important to stabilizing the relationship. And when you jeopardize that economic piece, as we are seeing happening this morning, then we should expect this will have ramifications that could be quite consequential in the security and political realms. Already, China has been acting very aggressively vis-a-vis Taiwan over the last several weeks or so, and I would expect to see more of that kind of behavior. So I'm very concerned not only about the global economy, but I'm concerned about the security order as well.
And there will be ripple effects on the energy markets as well. Frank, I want to bring you in. You served in the first Trump administration. You focused on energy. I know you're not a tariffs guy, but if you have to reflect a little bit on how this second administration, 80 days in now, how it affects all the things that you worked on in the first administration.
Yeah, thank you. I would say we've kind of gone to a reset of the kind of the orthodoxy, the kind of organizing principle of the first Trump administration that looked at energy through very clearly through a security lens. You've seen that illustrated multiple times, just in virtue of you can look at the executive orders that have been issued. 3 of those, the unleashing American energy dominance, declaration of an energy emergency, and then on the critical minerals executive order, and of course we can talk about it in the context of the tariffs as well. So I would look at it in terms of the energy space, a very clear reorganization and a recognition of energy. And it also is interesting to me that there's the declaration of an energy emergency, not because the emergency is today, but it's forward-looking. So we're looking at, in particular, the build-out of AI and electrification of the United States and new power demands. And so the administration declared an emergency to take action so that it can actually have the mechanics domestically to meet that challenge in the near to midterm that's happening. I think that's a significant step, and usually government tends to be the latent indicator of everything. In this instance, I think they're trying to get ahead of what's coming. It also speaks to the context of this dependency mindset, and in particular, in kind of the building blocks to the modern economy, and of which critical minerals are a key input. To have a real break and see what China, to avoid creating this dependency on China, or to exacerbate the existing dependencies in which the U.S. and the West more broadly have on China, in a similar fashion that, to moved Germany becoming dependent on Russian gas. And so how do we break that cycle? And so I think some of the moves are intended to do just that. The tariffs, I think, we'll have to see how that plays out, but I think that's also, and then on the ongoing escalation, these are means to start that recalibration. I think, how do you recalibrate? And I think Megan's observation about this, the imposition of these tariffs, really tested the received wisdom, as it were, that U.S. and China won't do this because they have too much to lose. Well, actually, that's certainly being tested. I think that was a poignant point. I guess the question is why. Back to this dependency concept. I think the current way in which America's and the West's dependency and reliance on China, how do you break that cycle? There's no way to do it comfortably. It's always going to impose a degree of pain. Now, one could argue, well, is this the right mechanism? Should they adopt a different pacing? Those are fair questions, but something had to change if there is that commitment to make a change. And I think that multiple governments of all parties have said we need to do something differently, and the Trump administration, in this instance, is doing something differently.
You could say that. Frank, I was listening very intently. You're very diplomatic. Amos, let me bring you in. oil prices have declined a fair bit. I think that they're lowest in 4 years now. And you know the Middle East better than almost anyone else I know. How do you think, given the last 80 days, and actually there is a little bit of consistency, I think, on the Middle East between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Feel free to disagree, but the variance is much greater in other domains. What is your sense of how the geopolitics of energy shifts, given the tariffs and given other changes that the Trump administration has brought in?
I'll have to think about how to talk about the variance on the Middle East. I think there may be some changes, but I think they're looking at what are we trying to solve. We're taking very big steps, and I'm going to narrow it to what we're talking about, the broad energy space. So let's take it, Frank talked about critical minerals, all the supply chain, renewables, clean, nuclear, oil and gas, and now coal. What's the problem we're trying to solve? 90 days ago, the United States was the largest producer of oil, in fact, at a historic level, an all-time high of oil production, gas production, LNG exports, even our oil and products exports. Prices were at a relatively comfortable level. They weren't too low. They were at roughly $70-something, both for Brent and TI. I think the Middle East felt as big producers that it wasn't the ideal price for them. They had gotten very comfortable with an $85 to $100 price that was for a couple of years before that, especially ahead and post of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And on renewables, the investments were a bit choppy in the U.S., specifically with high interest rates on offshore wind. But by and large, there was a clear path on investing into clean energy. Dan Yergin wrote a great article the other day, a few weeks ago. We should not talk about the energy transition. We should talk about the energy addition, meaning that demand is growing at such a level that no matter how much renewables we're bringing on, the net percentage of oil and gas and fossil fuels in the American economy, the broad global economy, stays roughly the same, right? We've gone from 85 to 80% in 35 years, but that's not because we're not actually massively increasing renewable energy, it's because of there. So I think Middle East folks they like the continuation of some of the policy, and I would say the much warmer reception that they're getting, what they feel they're getting in Washington. But at the same time, if the net goal is $50 oil, they don't understand how that means increased production. OPEC has increased production. We've seen OPEC members increasing production, so OPEC kind of decided post facto to increase the levels to match the actual level of production. So I think there's a bewilderment of what are we trying to achieve? And I think that's the biggest question. Are you trying to achieve low prices? As we've heard from the White House, they would like to have $50 oil. Well, that's very bad news for production, whether you're a producer in the shale patch in the US or in the offshore, or in the Middle East, where you're basing your oil revenues to invest into your future non-oil dependent industries. If you're trying to have a more lenient production policy and drilling policy and take away some of the effects of the regulations, well, that again bumps up against the very low oil prices. So I feel like there's been a lot of talk about solutions for the energy problem. Nobody knows what the problem was that we were trying to solve, and they're trying to reverse engineer how is this going to serve us. So from the way where I sit, I think the Middle East is no different than anybody else around the world trying to figure that piece out of where am I supposed to put my dollars? And I think the private sector is saying, what am I financing right now? Right? Where in the energy sector do I need to finance? One, if I'm in a tariff war, then global demand is going to go down because of a reduction in general economic activity and output, which is directly correlated to energy. And I don't know where things are. And I'll end with, I think the biggest issue that I'm trying to understand, maybe the irony for a Democrat to say this, but if we're trying to bring the manufacturing back here, which I think to solve the problem of the supply chains that Frank accurately pointed out, that we do have that vulnerability, you have two different approaches now. In the previous administration, it was tax incentives and reducing costs, which I think wasn't enough, to be honest, versus tax imposition and increasing taxes. And so I think one would have, if you just presented it blindly to people, you would say, tell me who proposed which. I think they would think it was the other way around. But I think that's where we are. We're trying to do this by imposing a tax. And I think that bringing manufacturing back takes a really long time. And to Megan's point, I don't know how much time we have. So I think the Middle East, for the last 5 years, changed its view towards, I want to invest in my future, in my non-fossil future, and they've done enormously amazing things. I mean, UAE and AI and really investing in technology, Saudi Arabia and building out the infrastructures, but they still require these prices to be at a certain level that they can afford that. And I think that's greatly challenged at the moment, both by trying to drive the price down and by reducing overall demand for energy products.
Sure. Yeah, and this is often called a break-even price, and $50, for example, would not be break-even for most oil exporters.
But Robbie, break-even is mistakenly looked at the price of, in America, break-even is the price of the production. In the Middle East, the break-even is the price of my revenue towards my budget, and my budget is significantly higher than the cost of oil production. So we often in the press, I see there's this confusion of what that means, the break-even. It's so dramatically different in the Middle East and the US.
Yeah, that's very true. They're not diversified enough. David, let me bring you in. I mean, you have your finger on the pulse in so many countries around the world through the IRC, and it's telling that, on the one hand, part of this discussion is about slowing economic growth, therefore lower oil prices as countries drill more. But there's a flip side of this as well, which is the energy security and then the climate insecurity element of it, which doesn't get talked about enough anymore.
Thanks. Let me just say a word about the geopolitics and then address your question. I think that we should challenge the idea that we're in a stable move to a multipolar environment. You hear a lot about a multipolar world. That conjures up to me, do you remember when you did chemistry, there were sort of 6 or 7 different colored balls and there were rods holding them together. It suggested a stable ecosystem. I think we're moving into a much more fluid, much more volatile, much more dangerous situation, which I think was an Indian diplomat 15 or 20 years ago called it a multi-aligned world. And in a multi-aligned world, there are shifting coalitions on different issues at different times. And that feels to me to speak much more directly to the geopolitical situation that we're facing. We're seeing some alliances that are based on values that are being shredded. We're seeing alliances based on geography, interestingly, being reinforced in Europe. Even though the UK is out of the EU, it's seeing its interdependence with the rest of Europe. You're seeing Southeast Asian countries thinking in a similar way. You're seeing other transactional and interest-based alliances. So in that context, I think the energy security, climate insecurity question plays in a very interesting way. In summary, I would say that the multi-aligned world reinforces the insecurity, both on the energy and on the climate side, and the insecurities reinforce the multi-alignment. And the work that I do, I mean, you very generously said I've got my finger on the pulse of many countries. I've got my finger on the pulse of many countries that have got very big problems because we work in conflict zones. One interesting case is obviously Democratic Republic of Congo. It's blessed in some ways by its resources, but it's also cursed by its resources. It's a conflict state. And one of the interesting things about a place like the Democratic Republic of Congo is that it's a conflict state that's also a climate vulnerable state. 16 of the top 20 countries on the IRC's emergency humanitarian watch list are also in the top quartile of climate vulnerability on the Notre Dame index. So the overlap between conflict and climate crisis is growing stronger and stronger, and that's reinforcing each other. And so I guess what I fear about this multi-aligned world is it doesn't have the political leverage to manage the commons. It's a tragedy of the commons situation. And if you think about some of the raging conflicts that exist at the moment, the diplomatic leverage is not there. And that is creating a very dangerous cycle, I would say.
Megan, I'd love for you to pick up on that, this idea of a multi-aligned world. And that sounds like energy security will be harder to come by in a world that has less trust, fewer alliances, more competition.
Sure, and I think I can be relatively brief here because it does seem that we've had decades of reinforcement about how energy security is enhanced by integrated global markets. And we've seen this in our own country, even as we have become more energy proficient or energy independent or energy dominant, whatever word you want to use, as we have become the world's largest producer of oil and gas, we've still been very integrated into global markets, and that has been very much to our benefit. And so if you think about extreme weather and how it's impacted our energy infrastructure, think about the floods in Houston or hurricanes or any of that, the fact that we have been integrated into global markets has allowed the United States and others to manage these kinds of weather-induced crises and potentially other kinds of induced crises relatively smoothly and without huge dislocations. So certainly a world where our energy relationships would follow the kind of fracturing that we've been talking about on this panel would seem to be one that would be less energy secure. And I think even if you assume that some of the objectives of the current policies are meant in the sense of reshoring manufacturing and bringing supply chains into the United States, as my colleagues have mentioned, this is going to take a long period of time. So I had the pleasure of hosting Lord Brown up at Harvard yesterday, and we had an interesting conversation about why doesn't oil and gas, why don't we just stop using oil and gas right now in order to usher in more climate-friendly energies, that putting a kibosh on that kind of fossil fuel use is the only thing that's going to get us to a clean energy future. Well, to some extent, we're seeing almost the reverse of that as it comes to China. Like, well, we're just going to stop the economic relationship with China, and maybe that is going to inspire, force, or compel the emergence of industries. But that, of course, both arguments only makes sense if one is willing to assume extreme levels of dislocation and economic pain in the short and medium term. So I think that certainly if we do move into a world that is either kind of multipolar, that could be manageable. But if we move into a world that's more spheres of influence, which is something we haven't talked about yet on this panel, but seems very consistent with a lot of the things we've heard out of the Trump administration thus far, that the Western Hemisphere is very important. America needs to be strong and dominant there. That Europe, the European continent, could be more one that is dealing with its own issues by itself, with less of a reliance on the United States, military and potentially economically. And then it's been unclear what this means for Asia. I think there was a thought that maybe the administration would double down on some of its relationships in Asia. I think, with the actions of the last week, it now looks like there's a more tolerance for this decoupling, not only tolerance, but desire for it, in which case, if we're a world that is a more spheres of influence world, it is probably one that is going to be less energy secure, although I'm sure there are people who would argue the opposite.
Yeah, thank you. This is a good reminder, actually, that if you would like to ask a question from the audience, there are QR codes right in front of you, so you can use those on your smartphones and then send in a question. Let me come to Frank. Frank, not to put you on the spot to sort of defend the Trump administration, or at least this particular administration, but I'm curious how, when you hear things like what Megan just said about how more interdependence, more openness helps the energy markets, but also helps the energy transition towards clean energy. And I hear you on the point that dependencies probably needed to be reformed. You used the phrase break the cycle. Break is maybe a bit violent in my mind. But how do you square that? How do you then think about energy as something that requires dependency, and yet when you think of a world in which America is decoupling, that just becomes a lot harder to do?
Well, I guess I would first challenge kind of the implied virtue that clean energy technology is always good. I think we ought to consider that in light of how it's being produced and how it's being made. I was in New York in September during Climate Week. We were speaking just about this question. And there was considerable enthusiasm for for climate action, calls to continue the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of enthusiasm in various quarters by business and various advocacy and NGO groups, all well-intended. But what I was struck by was there was absolutely no mention of, about 2 weeks before that occurred, the Biden administration's Department of Labor issued a report, which they produce, every Department of Labor does this, I believe, every year or two, a tracking report, global report on forced and child labor all around the world. And in this report, they specifically talked about and identified certain Chinese companies in certain countries. And they identified that it's actually the green energy transition is having a perverse outcome, and it's actually exacerbating the scale of child and forced labor. And they speak to certain locations where this is occurring. What I was struck by was this was not mentioned at all during Climate Week. There was no recognition of it. The media does not, it was not, I didn't see any reports. Perhaps it was.
But isn't that a problem with the implementation, not the idea?
Sure, exactly. But there isn't there was considerable attention to social cost of carbon, trying to internalize these other concepts, and nowhere is this concept kind of being talked about. And I think this is one of the issues that needs to be addressed if we're going to have this concept of having a just energy transition, if we're going to talk about having the Southern Hemisphere also benefit from the adoption of policies in the Northern Hemisphere. How are we going to do that if there's this opaque system, which is currently how much of the clean energy from the mine site to the production to refining, et cetera, is being advanced? We need to provide a degree of transparency in that. I think multiple administrations, again, have talked about calls for that, but there isn't the appropriate pricing signal. So then we come to tariffs. Is that a potential measure? And Amos talked about, the carrots and the sticks. And I would say we need both in terms of forcing a behavioral change. We need to continue incentives. And I would argue that the Trump administration's executive order on critical minerals was, they proposed to use COVID-era emergency powers to change the investment of tools, international finance tools, to invest domestically. So that could be a carrot, while you're just doing the same thing with the stick. We need both, especially given the scale of the challenge we have. But I think I just wanted to put that out there because I don't think it's talked about ever, and I think we need to be honest about how are the goods that we're producing, and if we in the West can do it better. And by the way, it's going to cost more, by definition.
Amos, I'm going to let you respond to that.
Is there child labor in mining? Yes, there was before the clean energy. There will be after.
Sure.
Is there slave labor and forced labor in China, and child labor and poor working conditions in China and by Chinese companies in sub-Saharan Africa and some areas in Southeast Asia? 100%. I think the answer is not to say, therefore, we should not do as much on clean energy. I think that the proposition is, Let's try to incentivize building clean energy here. Let's try to incentivize mining here. Let's try to incentivize the supply chain to move here, knowing it is really, really hard. For those who work in the financial world, there's not a lot of appetite for financing mining, whether it is in Africa or in the United States. It is not a high-yield industry, and it's very difficult to raise capital for it. And I think actually AI, and there's already a lot of proof that AI can solve some of those issues. But the solution is not to say, I don't want EVs, or I don't want solar panels, or I don't want magnets for turbines for wind because of that. But let's solve it. And the way to solve it is to try to say, how do we engage in Southeast Asia? How do we engage more fully in Sub-Saharan Africa so that we incentivize US, Australian, European companies to do it together, because alone we will not be able to compete with the Chinese dollar for dollar. So the solution is to come together with our allies, who we share values with, and to incentivize those kinds of production facilities, mining and processing, so that it's not 80-90% in China, and that it is not 80-90% Chinese companies in the rest of the world. And I think that is possible. We took steps towards that, not nearly enough. The United States needs to do two things. One is to reduce the cost of capital for investments overseas, to reduce the regulatory and cost of capital for investment in this area in the United States, and third, to use the power of the purse of the United States, whether it's the Defense Department or other security agencies and the federal government, as purchasing power that guarantees offtake, so that you can bring these and incentivize the industries to invest in the United States. We have to do those things all together, and knowing that some of this takes a really long time. So if you make an investment today in some of these supply chains, in the mining, it could take 15 years before we get anything out of the ground, if it's a greenfield. So the pulling out of our support for Africa, pulling out our support for our allies and working together, to me is counterproductive. I take Frank's point that you have to have the full value of greener technologies, but I think it's disingenuous to say that that's sort of a flaw in the green energy system. It's a flaw of much greater proportions, and we should address it, and we should continue. Again, going back to what we talked about, the energy addition. If we don't add more clean energy into the mix, we actually won't have enough of the energy. If we didn't add all that we have done so far in the last 15 years on the clean energy side, then fossil fuels would not have gone from 85 to 80%. They would have gone from 85 to 95% relative to demand. Demand is going up. And I don't think the solution is to increase coal production in increasingly residential areas, but rather to see how we continue this energy addition to turn it into an energy transition.
Megan wanted to jump in, and then I'm going to go to David.
Yeah, just I appreciate the exchange about the interdependence as it relates to the clean energy technologies. But I would say my comment about the integration of energy markets wasn't meant just to refer to the clean energy system. I think we also have to look at the question of the integration of global oil and gas. And so we see this morning that there's an exchange between the Trump administration and the EU about, can the EU buy $350 billion worth of LNG? And of course, when China, with the tariffs, China has stopped the import of US LNG and presumably the contracts that would come forward, the much larger contracts that would come forward in subsequent years. So I think here we have to say, what does the world look like in terms of the integration of oil and gas markets in a world where the United States may not be seen as the reliable supplier that has been seen for the last decades, or even maybe not a supplier, but a reliable actor in the global markets that is, its actions and exports and imports are driven, largely by market considerations. That's a different energy world, I think, in some respects. Of course, it's not entirely new because the use of U.S. sanctions against oil producers has been a feature of the international system in the U.S. foreign policy for a while. But we're moving into a world where American energy imports are fundamental to this conversation about trade and about geopolitics.
David, I'm curious how, when you listen to all of this, and if you put your sort of non-American hat on.
I only have a non-American hat.
You're a New Yorker. You're a New Yorker.
I'm a visitor who lives in New York, but I can't put on an American hat since I'm a British citizen, I'm afraid.
There you go. How much damage is being done to America's standing in the world, its alliances, and therefore, through that, its ability to strike deals, whether it's on energy, whether it's on anything else? And how lasting could that damage be?
Well, I think it's impossible to overstate the nature of the reset that is going on in the minds of policymakers around the world about how they view their relationship with the United States. For countries that are allies, they are very committed to remaining allies, but they wouldn't be doing their jobs if they didn't hedge against the possibility that America is at best going to be demanding a different price for its alliance, and at worst, moving into a different kind of relationship. And if you are a third party, if you're not in a formal alliance with the United States, you have engaged in a way that has, yes, brought benefit from the way in which the US has been the anchor of the global system, but you fear greatly what happens when the anchor is pulled up. I'm not a sailing person, but in choppy seas, if you pull up the anchor, a lot of passengers are going to get very seasick. And that is what I think is being felt around the world at the moment. People are looking, how can we put some buoys around the boat to try and stabilize things? And that involves thinking in a very hard-headed way about where you can find alliances, where you can find engagement. You use the word deal, obviously, at the end of your question, and I think there's a really important point for, this is obviously an international audience, but for the Americans here, the deal that has been struck over the last 80 years or so has been a long-term deal, not just a short-term deal. You can split it into periods. You can say that there was a 45-year deal after 1945 during the Cold War that allies struck. But actually, across the wider range, the anchoring role of the United States as the world's largest economy has been very fundamental to the way in which every country has positioned itself. Now, Fareed's book, The Post-American World, wasn't about America disappearing, but it was about the rise of other countries and the way in which that would refashion their relationships. Yes, they would take on greater responsibilities, but there's a very strong view, I would argue, that the fact that America's share of global GDP hasn't changed since 1990. Its share of global GDP in 1990 was 25%. Its share of global GDP today is 25%. There's a very strong view that the engagement that America has had as a global anchor has benefited America, not just benefited the rest of the world. And that's where the head-scratching is, frankly, not just from people who are living abroad, but those of us who are living here, that it's seen as an emergency in this country at the moment by policymakers, by today's policymakers. And if you look at America with non-American eyes, you see, yes, big challenges, big problems, but you also see big benefits from its global role. And the asymmetry of view, I think, is very important as you think about how other countries are going to be positioning themselves. Just a final point, I think it's worthwhile asking, as America's share of global GDP has stayed constant since 1990, has its share of global political leverage remained constant? And I would argue it hasn't, and that's part of the answer to your question.
We got some questions that I'm going to read out as comments, really. One was directed at Frank. Frank, if you want to try a very quick answer, but the question/comment is, with due respect, the Biden administration passed key pieces of legislation, IRA, CHIPS, etc., specifically designed to meaningfully decouple critical industries and supply chains from China. what, in your view, is Trump aiming to achieve with the tariffs? This sort of addresses the point you were making about, breaking the cycle, as it were. But, in the minute we have left, if you'd like to attempt a quick sort of maybe rejoinder to what David said, which is that things weren't that bad. I mean, America, in the eyes of the world, was doing pretty well. Why this sort of the deployment of this idea of breaking the cycle?
Yeah, I guess I don't know. It will take more than the 35 seconds, but just questioning, well, what does that mean in terms of relative to whom? The whom matters a lot here. And this question about U.S. influence over time, I mean, I would reflect on the work of a scholar here at Columbia, Andrew Kamau, who wrote a fascinating piece which looked at U.S. investment over time he looked at about 6 or 8 sub-Saharan African countries. How much money the U.S. government was spending in those countries, what was the form of that spend? It was grants. And what were the Chinese spending in the same countries, all loans for extraction of something? And what is the relative receptivity in those countries? Who's more popular, U.S. or China? And it's by far China. So what one could deduce from that is a transactional kind of approach actually improves relations in this subset of countries. So I think we just need to challenge the concept and question when we say we were doing better this way or that way. I think it's a far more nuanced question in terms of a lot of these answers, and that speaks to our foreign policy as well.
All right. I can think of a refutation, but we are out of time. Let's thank our guests here, our panelists, who were fantastic. Thank you.